It's not number one notes. There's just no way. I mean, he does this 30 times a year, but still.
All right, so my goal is not to bless any particular media type, because different people who have different needs and different media types are designed to have different characteristics. My goal is to instead get you to think about hypermedia as a thing, and then decide when can you reuse an existing one versus when do you have to create your own. And if you do create your own, what characteristics are you going to design into it such that it does what you want it to do along the lines of what we've discussed. So I'm going to use another media type that Mike designed, just because it's conceptually simple, but again, I'm not necessarily suggesting that you should use this for any and all types of hypermedia. So one of the things that Mike realized is that the problem of managing collections of arbitrary links to arbitrary resources is fairly consistent across the different types of resources. So collections of accounts, collections of orders, collections of products, collections of employees, collections of lights. Right? You want some ability to paginate, you want some ability to discover the items in that collection, some ability to query the collection, some ability to add things to the collection. So he designed this media type called collections plus JSON to solve this problem. And obviously he registered the name as well. So he designed this to have all 5 link hypermedia factors plus the ability to specify link context control. So here, I'm going to give you a quick introduction. There's going to be at least some of you who are going to absolutely hate something he did. That's okay, right? Just move on. It's not that big of a deal. But I'll explain why he did it. So this is a JSON representation. So we have collections. The collection type itself is versioned. So version 1 of the standard. There are extensions to the standards that make the kind of things that I'm about to show you more optimal. I'm not supporting any of those. This is just sort of a thought piece. So the idea here is, here I can have a collection of something, and I may want to pass this collection around to other parties as part of some kind of orchestration. So I'll put a reference to the collection itself, so that if you ask for something and then hand it off to her, she can find her way back to the collection to dig into it deeper, add things to it. I copied this example from, I think, the documentation just to show the required parts. But it's kind of sad because it looks like I have no friends. My collection is empty. The parts that are not required, you can have links associated with the collection itself, items in the collection, various ways to query the collection, templates to know how to collect information from the client to put stuff back into the collection, and then an extensible error handling mechanism that I'm not going to focus on. So one of the things that I often do will use this mechanism to advertise the capabilities of an API. So a well-known starting point for an API, I'll give you back a collection with links with various rel types. Like here's how you ask for information about accounts, or orders, or products. And I can extend that, and I can add new capabilities in the future without breaking anybody existing. Right? Oh, hey, there's now promotions, or sales, or some other mechanism. That shouldn't break anybody. And yet, clients that do want to roll out support for that can roll out a new version, and then they can go and look for these things. Now, I often get a pushback from when I do consulting with teams and just throw something like this out there. This is so inefficient. We now have to go all the time and go and get the API configuration. We can just put it in an array and store it on the client. Well, now you've hard-coded it, right? That's not cool. And oh, by the way, what have I done? I've turned the configuration of the API into an information resource. Who knows when the API is going to change? Server. What can the server do? Can use cache controls around this to say, oh yeah, nothing's changed and we're not rolling out a new version in at least 3 days, so don't bother coming back. Right? I could put cache controls around this kind of configuration so you don't have to go back to the server all the time. And yet, as we get close to a release, and we don't know exactly when it's going to happen, I'll reduce the 3 days to 1 day, half a day, and then eventually you'll learn, anybody who hits it will learn the new capabilities. None of them will probably support it yet, but again, things just roll out. Just like rolling out your new web page doesn't require everybody to change their browser. So once you ask for the link with the rel type of account, again, you have to understand the media type, you have to understand how the media type applies to the domain, but you don't have to understand the individual links. You don't have to know them beforehand, and you don't even have to understand things like pagination. If you find a link with a rel type of next associated with the collection, what do you have to know? Id, right? Oh, okay, that's now the thing that I've asked for. That's now the collection. Here's a link with a rel type of previous. Here's a link with a rel type of next. You do not have to understand my pagination scheme, and yet you now can find your way from the beginning to the end, from the end to the beginning, from the middle out. It doesn't matter. And if I change my pagination scheme tomorrow, guess what? It all still works. This is where Hypermedia starts to become useful and usable. And so your heuristic is, if there's a link with a rel type of next, I know I don't have the whole set, but I now know how to find it. And I can keep asking for the next until I run out of nexts, and then it's done. So we could have a link with a rel type of feed as a way of saying, oh, this is a collection you're interested in. Here, follow this feed, and I will advertise as things are added to the collection. You don't have to poll all the time. You don't have to come back and do the comparisons yourself. I'll tell you what's new by exposing a feed to it. So these links are really around the collection itself. And then items are arrays of JSON objects. Now, the trick here is to get the right amount of information. If you just have links to the items, this is totally useless. Because now to find anything interesting, you have to go hit all the links, which is going to perform like something that doesn't perform very well. Now, the opposite is not the right answer either, right? You don't want to put everything that you know about every item because you're wasting bandwidth at that point. You want to find a nice sweet spot that most of the people who look at this collection are going to want to see this kind of information, and if they want to know more, then they can follow a link back to the item itself and get a more detailed view of the item. Now the thing that you're not going to like is what he did here, and what he did here. So an item is a JSON object, it has its own identity, then there's the domain-specific part of this, and then there are perhaps links associated with the items themselves. So if this is an account, a link with a rel type of open might be a way of advertising, here are the open accounts for this, open orders for this account, or the recent orders, or the current order, or the last 6 months, or canceled orders, or whatever, whatever kinds of things you want to do, you can advertise this relationship between this item and other items using this kind of mechanism. And it's an extensible mechanism, and nothing breaks when you add new types of relationships. But this part right here, you probably just would have said, username Bob, ID 9468. But because this is a domain general representation of arbitrary collections of resources, and he wanted it to be able to validate, the only valid keys for the data elements as defined in 1.0 of this standard are name and value. So he can validate the structure of a collections plus JSON document even though it's applying to arbitrary domains. So if I had username and ID and favorite color and blood type and number of cylinders and who knows what's in there? I don't know how to validate that the structure of the document is okay. So that's why this seeming unnecessary, the name of the key is name, and its username. The name of the key is value, and its value is Bob, which is really the value of that key. You would not believe what kind of bitching and moaning this drives developed. Well, you probably would. You probably work with people like that. Notice I'm not assuming that you are people. But anyway, that's fine, we're just going to move on. This is a tool to represent collections of arbitrary resources. Now, the final thing that I'm going to focus on is how do I query these collections? How do I know how to ask questions of them? And again, we have a collection of JSON objects that advertise things like this. Here is a link with a rel type of search. Here's the href. And by the way, I'm using RFC 6570 URI template encoding. So I'm not giving you actual URLs here. I'm giving you templates to URLs, and that's, if you're looking at /account, so the set of all accounts, that much is specified. That is the space that you're looking at. And by the way, the things that you can use to filter it further are status, page number, items per page. And for your convenience, I tell you what these are currently set to, which is nothing. Why am I telling you that these things are set to nothing? You don't have to query it. You don't have to know whether we're talking about accounts or people or orders. It's basically, those are the values that you can take, and currently there are no values set for them, because if you're looking at a different collection, the page 2 of open status accounts, hey, status, value open, page 2, right? When you're building up the request to ask the question back to the server, you don't have to understand the scheme, you just have to understand how to plug any values that have been captured back into the scheme, either from the server that you presented in a user interface to the client. Maybe they changed it, maybe they kept what was there before, maybe they added something to it. All you know is you have some more values, you plug them back in if there's a value. If the user goes through and gets rid of page 2, then you go back to the set of all open status orders. The media type tells you how to learn how to ask questions of the information space. That's all. Beyond that, you can apply it to any kind of system. All right, so let's apply these ideas to build a level 3 API for our RQ system. Number 1, the API has a well-known starting point. I've got an implementation of this. My presentation system uses an environment called netkernel. I have a module in there to implement my level 3 Hypermedia system. I am not able to share this based on the EULA agreement because they don't want people bridging the level 2 API, but I have contacted a few people for pedagogical purposes. You know, this is what I'm presenting. Okay, the camera's off, right? All right, camera's off. Contact me and I'll share it with you. Oh wait, crap, the camera wasn't off. No, I can't distribute this, but you know, for pedagogical reasons, if you want to play around with it, let me know and I'll let you do so. So, if I hit this /Q API, this is my well-known starting point, I will get back a content type of application VND collections, like I showed you. Here are the things that you can do, but now I'm applying it to find all the bridges that are on the current network. Each bridge can support up to 50 lights. One thing I forgot to mention, these lights communicate via a mesh network, low energy mesh network called Zigbee. So Ethernet connection comes in, Zigbee radio protocol, and that's part of the junk that's in these boxes right here. But the light bulbs themselves have them as well. Any standard light lamp will take them, but they create a mesh network because you can imagine your bridge is where your router is, and you've got lights all the way on the other side of the house without good Wi-Fi connection. But if you have other lights throughout, they'll pass messages on to each other. So you're probably only going to have one bridge, but conceptually you could have two. Here's how you find out about all the lights. Here's how you find out about groups of lights. And you can put lights into groups and turn them all on and off at the same time. You can set up schedules. You can do whatever you want to sort of extend this API with different kind of capabilities. But what you don't have to know is, first step, go back to their servers, hit this particular magic URL, get back some JSON that you know how to parse, then you get back the IP address, which then becomes the basis of the bridge, by which then you've memorized how to interact with it because you read the API documentation, blah, 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 blah. The point is, you want information about lights? Hit that one. I'll tell you about the lights. Want information about the bridges? Hit that one. I'll tell you about the bridges. So, bridge, boom. I chose to represent a single thing as a collection with one thing in it, just for the purposes of this talk. You know, I could have come up with a different media type. Doesn't really matter. So, the set of all bridges, there's only one bridge. Here's the name value pairs that I'll tell you about, the ID, the internal IP. But you could imagine maybe finding bridges based on their ID, finding bridges based on their IP address. Maybe you have one per floor. Find me the bridge that's on floor 3. I don't know what his IP address, but that's the one I want to talk to because I want to turn on the lights and wake everybody up. Whatever. So I can advertise how to query the bridge space by using something like we just discussed for accounts. Now lights. So from Hue API, link with a rel type of light, take us here. I can find the names of the lights. Find me all the lights that are on. Find me all the lights that are attached to a particular bridge or a particular group, or that are red, or that are flashing or color looping. You know, again, you could have any number of ways of filtering and querying the set of all lights, and that's where this starts to become really interesting, right? So we have that capacity. Discover from there the link to individual lights. Again, I'm not parsing pieces and shoving other things in there. Oh, you want the thing attached to the name strip 1? Issue a request. Boom. Here's all the data. This is the state of the light. I'm not having to draw distinctions between the name and the attributes that you can change and the attributes that you can't change. I'm just going to tell them, like, here's what I know and here's what the values are. However, if you are allowed to modify the light, then I will advertise a link with a rel type of edit to indicate to the user interface, hey, let this person modify these values so they can actually interact with the lighting system. And the lighting values that they can interact with, I'll give you in the template section. So here are the values that you can change, here are their current values, and here's a prompt that tells you how to build up a user interface to collect the information from the user. Whether you are using a desktop browser, an iPhone, an Android phone, some kind of third-party REST client written in Bash script and Perl and awk, right? So, this is the thing. It exists. Hue, API, hey, Shazam, get back some collections plus JSON, bridge, lights, groups, give me information about the bridge, here are the bridges, give me information about lights. Cool, there's the lights, give me information about a particular light. Boom, there's the information about the light. It's on. Its effect is color loop because it's still in the same state from before when I did it through their API. In here, I have links with rel types of edit. I have templates that tell me what the values are. I could try to impress you by creating the JSON on the command line and then passing it into curl and failing spectacularly on camera. So instead I want to blow your mind. Okay? We have the capacity to have good, stable, long-lived identifiers. And when I ask for this stuff on curl, I'm not asking for anything in particular. Right? This is passing an accept header of star.star. If I ask for these same resources in a browser, Hue API, exact same endpoint. What is the browser going to say? Can I have this in my preferred format, which is HTML? So my system generates the collections plus JSON as sort of the canonical representation, but it says, oh, you want it as HTML? Sure, I'll put it in HTML. And that is a standard transformation that knows nothing about lights or hue or anything. It's just a collections plus JSON to HTML converter. And that is free to take advantage of what it knows about the client. You know, interrogate the client user agent. Oh, you're in a late model browser. Then I can use HTML5, and I can use, I can render the collection of links in the API configuration using the jQuery data table mechanism. Not very interesting here, but let's go through and look at lights. So I can now filter, sort these things based on name. I can filter it, look for strip 1.
Where is the JSON to HTML?
That is happening on the back end. My module knows how to generate the stuff, but based on the client asking for it as HTML, it says, oh, okay, then I will do that swap. And it could do something different targeting a phone versus a desktop application. But because it knows that you're using a browser, then something like a jQuery data table is an okay thing to put in there. But that decision has nothing to do with the lights or anything like that. That's just, I've got a collection of things that you may want to filter and do something with, so I'll let you be able to do that. Now this strip 1 is doing, it's pulling out the thing called strip 1, but notice strip 3 also has an ID 1, so it's picking up both of those there. Alright, so that's kind of cool. Now, I ask for a particular item, and the code is, hey, is there a link with a rel type of edit? Yes? Okay, is there a template? Yes? Okay, here's the attributes, here's the stuff that you can't change, but let me just barf out the values of what's the state of that thing. But because there's a link with a rel type of edit, and a template section, I now have a form at the bottom. And my browser just invoked the behavior to turn off the light. How much API documentation did my browser read? None. And that is what is so freaking awesome about Hypermedia. Because devices that know nothing about the thing that they're manipulating can be written in such a way that they allow someone to interact with it. So, let's turn it back on. Let's change this to L-select. Let's change the hue to 50,000. Right? There's nothing light specific in this API, and yet I'm able to reuse a hypermedia format to advertise capabilities and use standard transformations to turn it into a format that this client knows how to use.
So what's creating this table and the format and all that?
That's just a standard transformation that I added in the content negotiation part of my API. By default, I'm just going to barf out the collections plus JSON. But if the client says, hey, can I please have this as HTML, then it says, oh, sure, let me run it through a transformation first. And all the decisions, that's just me. It's my making choices in what to produce, but I could produce one type of representation for this kind of a browser. I could produce something else that pops up color selector wheels and things like that, rather than making you type in numbers representing the hue and the saturation. That's just the server expressing to a client a user interface that the client then uses to interact with the back-end resources using a hypermedia representation. Any questions?
Exceptions. What happens if you type in a hue or a brightness that is beyond its capability?
So this is a toy example, right? But there are extensions to collections plus JSON that allow you to put metadata about this. So this is a required field, this is a numeric range. I could rely on existing HTML5 input ranges and things like that based on that metadata. So there's all the other kinds of things that you could do for that.
Does that get more into the now knowing more about what I'm manipulating aspect?
Again, it's the server that's interpreting the metadata to present something to the user. If I tell you that this is a color, then the server can choose to represent that as a color wheel to the client. The client doesn't know what's going on. It's just being handed something to interact with. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, effectively, we now have the capacity to have clients and servers interact with us, with each other, evolve independently, supporting different types of interactions. But at the end of the day, right, we're still developers, we still like to program in programming languages, but it's no hard problem to take these ideas and map them back cleanly into a language-based environment. I truly despise most of the language-based REST libraries because they favor the language convenience over the API design. And that's, I mean, you might as well just use RMI, right, if that's what you want to do. But using a good API, like one of my favorites is the RESTlet API. It spent a long time designing an API, and they broke it a dozen different times. But they ended up at something that is a very clean, easy-to-use API that also respects the architectural choices, right? So they don't compromise necessarily on the design. So here, I'm going to just have some unit tests that use the RESTlet client API to wrap a resource. Now, you can actually register with the content negotiation mechanism, so you don't have to do this every single time, but I just want to show you how easy it is to do. Get the resource as a parsed collection. So I'm using a library that understands how to turn collections plus JSON into Java objects. I'm passing in a URL. I'm obviously using some Groovy here. So client resource, wrap that URL. That's RESTlet client API. Get it, because it behaves just as the same as every other resource in the world. And then take the stream that's coming back and parse it through the library that understands how to convert collections plus JSON into an object. So that's the kind of thing that, again, I could have registered a handler for application VND collections plus JSON, but this is what it would be doing. It's not rocket surgery. So now I can do things like find a light by name. I go to the starting point. Well, what is the starting point? The starting point is fetched as part of the before of the test. Give me the Hue API as a collection. So go to the starting point, get the current configuration of the API, parse it as a collections plus JSON Java object, and now that's available for me to do things like find links by rel. Is there a bridge link? Is there a light link? Is there a group link? Is there a schedule link? Find a light. Give me a light by name. Once I have it, is it on? Give me the href of the collection's links and set it to be not whatever it is. If it is on, turn it off. The point is, it's now quite easy to write code using programmatic conveniences that we're all happy with to do things like turn off all the lights. So this is just, I've got a lot going on my machine. So it's starting up, boom, 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 boom. Finds the references to the lights, finds the URLs, and then turns them all off. Now, it would be more convenient to put them into groups and then turn them on and off as a group. I didn't bother doing that, but that would be a more appropriate use of this to avoid 3 round trips. But even so, it's not the end of the world, right? So I can turn them all back on by running this code. And now, having code that runs the service that hits the current weather API that weather underground or something like that, look for certain keywords, look for severe weather events, reach out and interact with this. That kind of thing is trivial. It's like 4 lines of code to set up using a language like Groovy around a standard resource representation that behaves just like every other resource representation through a tool like the RESTlet client. So this becomes almost like RMI, but RMI that doesn't suck, because you can also call it from Bash and Python and OCaml and Ruby and whatever else you want to as well. So finally, I created a little test called Cycle the Lights. Find me references to each of the lights, find out whether they're on, repeat 5 times. If they're on, turn them off. If they're off, turn them on. Do that 5 times. I did this during the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, so I set up the colors to red, white, and blue, and then obviously you can combine these into fun stuff.
Yeah, some patriotic.
I could have done like accounts and orders, and you would have all fallen asleep half an hour ago. So that's what I wanted to do. So your homework assignment. This was one of the first good books introducing the ideas of REST as a thing. Didn't tell you how to do anything. I just told you why you wanted to do these things. Then Sabu's book didn't tell you why to do anything, it just told you how to do things. Rest in Practice does a little bit of both. But these are all good books with the caution that this one, RESTful Web Services, has been kind of overcome by a new version of this that was released about a year ago in August. So still worth reading. All these books are available through Safari, so you can go read them all. And there's value in reading them all. But I want you to notice something very subtle here. RESTful Web Services. Okay, keep that in mind. This gets into application level protocols and security and solving specific kinds of problems. So this is kind of a good, how do we actually apply some of these ideas? Mike's first Hypermedia book, its title requires a little bit of explanation. As I said, Restafarians can be jackasses, and he didn't want to summon the jackasses, so he spoke in code and said this is a Hypermedia book. It's not a REST book, it's a Hypermedia book. O'Reilly wanted to sell a lot of them, so they put the words HTML5 and Node in there. But really, this is about building Hypermedia REST APIs. That being said, a lot of the ideas that went into this have been folded into the new version of the first book, which is now a new name. Right? We're not really focusing on services anymore, in part because the resource abstraction is a superset that includes services, and data, and documents, and concepts. Services are just one type of resource. So we're thinking about collections of resources that interwork together as a programmer interface into something. And so we're not really focusing on web services anymore, even though that may be what we're talking about. This is a very, very, very good modern book. My only complaint is that, as a semantic web nerd, where we have gotten is cool. It's a great place to be. But it pushes the burden of complexity to the client. The client now has to know to take your JSON and your XML and your Hypermedia, and now what do? I got to shove this all together. And that's where tools like RDF and Sparkle shine. So the linked data stuff, the semantic web stuff really takes these ideas, builds on what we've learned so far. That's the beauty. The most important part of the semantic web remains the web. But it drives the cost of data integration down effectively to zero. So, to me, that's crucial. It's crucial to solving connections of Internet of Things and other sorts of things. That being said, in this book, they basically categorize all of that capability as, you could serialize it as RDF too. So, I find that dismissive of the power that's actually there. It's a defensible position, right? It is just another serialization, but it's a serialization that kicks ass. That being said, this is a very, very, very good modern book. And if you want to sort of like really start to wrap your head around a lot of the things that I've talked about, this and the other ones are a great place to go. So there's also Sletten in action and some other ones as well. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it kind of opened your mind a little bit that Hypermedia doesn't have to be that much more difficult. It's not just when users are involved. It's not just when you want to overcomplicate things. It has a purpose, and the purpose comes from the server telling the client what it can do and how it should do it, as opposed to the client knowing. The client reacts. The client doesn't know beforehand. And that distinction is basically why the web works and why your REST APIs should work that way as well. So feel free to contact me. Here's my email address. If you have any questions, I'll get the slides to you. I won't give you the code because I can't, unless you ask for it. But I want to clean it up and put some simulator stuff into it as well, so you can play around with it even if you don't have the Hue system, but it'll work if you do have the Hue system as well. So, for purely pedagogical reasons. So, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Come see us in March if you get a chance. It's what we just did times 5 times 10 in 2 days. It's a tremendous amount of value, and this is my 10th year being part of it, and I've really enjoyed it. So, hope to see you there. Thank you very much.